Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We want to get the latest out of Capitol Hill now because there is some key action taking place on the Hill later this afternoon. And the one we're focused on, in large part here on Bloomberg TV and radio, is the action that will come in the Ways and Means Committee. Their markup of their draft tax bill released last night, scheduled for 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And of course, that bill does a lot of things. It makes good on some key campaign promises from President Trump, including, of course, an extension of the 2017 tax cuts. No tax on tipped income or overtime, at least until 2028. It raises the endowment tax as high as 21%. It doesn't create a new tax bracket for the wealthy, creates some deductions for auto loan interest, something else President Trump wanted to see. And of course, it lifts the SALT cap to $30,000, up from the current $10,000. The thing is, that's not enough for a lot of those Republican members who live in blue salt states like New York, including one Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York, who I spoke with about this on Balance of Power last night.
This bill, as written, with a $30,000 cap for those making under $400,000, is just woefully inadequate. And so, no, this does not have my support. It will not have my support. And if this bill comes to the floor for a vote, I will vote no.
For more, we turn to someone who has experience with navigating tax packages like this and markups like the one that will take place today. As the former chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Kevin Brady, Chairman Kevin Brady, is joining me now. He's now spokesman for the Alliance for Competitive Taxation. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Mr. Chairman. When you look at this package as a whole and the many different components in it, is its biggest weakness potentially this lower than expected lift to the SALT cap, at least for these SALT members? Could that actually tank this entire thing?
It could, Kaylee. Good to see you. So it is a big day in Washington, D.C. When the tax bill gets introduced, while it's not the final step, it is a huge step. So starting today in about an hour, we're going to see the Ways and Means Committee take this bill up, address amendments, ultimately pass out, hopefully sometime late tomorrow. And it's a big step. So the president should be pleased here. Certainly his priorities, as you pointed out, making so much of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, preserving and improving upon the middle class tax cuts, keeping that small business deduction, the first time we've ever created that, 2017, and expanding it some, I think very important as well. His priorities, as you pointed out, about $300 billion in tax relief on tips and overtime for Social Security, and some help on car loans for American-made autos. All, I think, big priorities for him as well. Certainly, to your point, the spending savings number is still up in the air, going to be a big part of this. The SALT number is still up in the air as well. I'm confident they will find a common ground here, but I would just point out, in 2017, only 8 counties in all of America had an average SALT deduction of more than $30,000. Today, it's gotten somewhat bigger, but the point being, you are, devoting about $300 billion or so to a relatively few number of counties, to a few number of taxpayers. And obviously, for both the president and tax writers, they're trying to juggle that against the numbers, the cap they have on deficits here, and also the fact that what they're doing in middle class families and small businesses, all that's hugely expensive. So yeah, there is a lot more conversations to be had, both as it goes to the floor next week as scheduled, and then through the Senate. Still a lot of work left to be done.
Well, and when we consider the price tag of all of this, the Ways and Means Committee had a $4.5 trillion cap, essentially, to the revenue that could be lost over the next decade as a result of this policy. And the Joint Committee on Taxation says it actually is only going to result in $3.7 trillion in lost revenue. And I wonder if you see that as by design, that they purposefully left themselves some margin to work with on some of these issues.
I think so, and for 3 reasons. They don't know yet what that spending number is going to be at the end of the day. when it goes through the Senate. That's, Kaylee, so key, because it's not only the key to passing the bill, it's to unlocking the Senate baseline, which allows tax writers to make more of these tax cuts permanent. So savings number is really big here. Again, they haven't finished out the SALT issue. They're very aggressive in the House on the Inflation Reduction Act. So as that moves through to the floor and through the Senate, there may be some changes there. So I think it was wise for them. And obviously for the fiscal conservatives, this is an effort to bring them into the fold here. So I think it was they were using some good strategy and good thinking in introducing this bill.
I also wonder, as we consider our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio, how you think the business, the corporate community should be looking at this package as a whole, knowing there was a lot of conversation around sea salt in particular. Sea, not like sea salt, like SEA salt, but like corporate state and local tax deduction. I feel like for some reason I have to make that clear, Mr. Chairman, but the sea salt conversation, the question around whether or not they would try to close the carried interest loophole, which they did not. Is this actually the best kind of package corporate America could have hoped for, short of bringing down substantially the corporate tax rate itself?
Yeah, so I think to your point, yes. I think for corporations, large or small, keeping that corporate rate as it is, not making permanent, but fully restoring those three tax provisions so key to innovation and competitiveness, like research and development, in full and immediate expensing. I think 5 years is what was in the bill. I think people would love to make that permanent, but that's a big step by itself. In the international tax space, which is where we made sure in 2017 our U.S. companies could compete and win anywhere in the world, including here at home. And when they succeeded bringing those profits and investment back to the United States, the tax writers avoided any tax hikes there, and I think sent a strong signal to our foreign competitors that their global tax is not going to impact our pro-growth tax areas. So from that standpoint, I think it was very strong. Certainly there aren't corporate SALT restrictions in there, which would have would have effectively been a backdoor approach on the corporate rate and increase there. I think there's satisfaction there as well. I think there's concern on the pass-through side, restrictions on their ability to work around the SALT cap. I think everyone's trying to digest who's impacted by that and to what degree. Certainly conservative heard raised today, but again, tax writers are trying to find that balance, and there will be changes made in this bill as it goes forward.
Well, and obviously we'll learn more, hopefully, about what changes will look like after this markup concludes, however long that takes. I've been told it could go well into the night tonight in Ways and Means, Mr. Chairman. But of course, it's not just Ways and Means that is marking things up today. The House Energy and Commerce Committee is as well. In fact, that starts sooner at 2 p.m. Eastern time. They've saved, according to the Congressional Budget Office, more than the $880 billion in cost savings that they were charged with. But as a result, according to the CBO, 13.7 million people could be kicked off Medicaid rolls over the next decade. We've heard from Republican Senator Josh Hawley, who says this is morally wrong, politically suicidal for Republicans. And I wonder how you yourself, from the outside now looking in, view this politically for Republicans as they consider their maps in 2026.
So I will tell you from my experience with Congressional Budget Office in 2017 on healthcare, their estimates of who is kicked off or kept on our healthcare programs is usually woefully wrong and off by millions. And in this case, I am skeptical about their conclusion. So if you look at what the reforms for Medicaid are, so who might lose their coverage? Those who are ineligible to be covered by Medicaid, those who are here undocumented and should not be eligible for Medicaid, able-bodied Americans, mainly men, who are capable of working or going to school or volunteering 20 hours a week. Certainly, if they want to stay on Medicaid, they can take those steps to do that. And then those who are impacted perhaps by reforms to the payment system. As you know, the way we fund Medicaid, it doesn't go to where people are at. It goes where matching funds are at. States have gained that to a pretty large degree. So if you look at the real reforms in Medicaid, it's hard to agree with that number of 13 million. And frankly, a number of those individuals, frankly, aren't eligible for Medicaid in the first place.
Okay, so perhaps you don't think this will be quite as politically suicidal as Senator Hawley is characterizing, if indeed the people affected are not as high in number. But I do wonder, it's not just Senator Hawley. There were a number of moderates who were concerned about this as well. Add those moderates to the people in the SALT caucus who are willing to die on the hill of the SALT cap with the fiscal conservatives in the House, the likes of Chip Roy, for example, who are saying spending cuts are not going far enough. As it stands right now, do you see the votes as being there on the House floor, knowing you expect this legislation to change, but just how hard with this narrow majority is it going to be to pass even changed legislation with all of these various factions who want different outcomes?
Well, ultimately, yes, I do believe it'll pass the House and ultimately the Senate, and I think it'll be done by that August 1st timetable for the debt ceiling issue. But will it be difficult at every step? Absolutely. It was in 2017. It will be now, especially with such a near zero majority. But everyone knows this. Everyone's staying at the table. The speaker, the committee leaders, the leadership, constant meetings with lawmakers, just as we did in 2017. And so, yeah, there are difficult challenges left. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm confident they'll get where they need to be on time.
All right, Mr. Chairman, good to have you, as always, especially on a day like today. The former chair of the House Ways and Means Committee and as spokesman for the Alliance for Competitive Taxation, Kevin Brady, here with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I am indeed Kaylee Lines in Washington, where President Trump is not today. He is in the Middle East instead, the first of a three-nation visit to the region being Saudi Arabia, where he touted today investment pledges made by the Saudis into the United States, although we knew about them largely already, to the tune of $600 billion. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman promising to try to get that number to the $1 trillion mark that President Trump has been seeking for some time now. And of course, President Trump had some kind words for the Crown Prince, viewing him as a friend, as a strong partner, to use his characterization, as we heard him speak at the Saudi-U.S. Investment Forum in Riyadh. But he also had plenty of words for the not friends, shall we say, talking specifically about Iran and how he wants to make sure that they never have a nuclear weapon, but also his hope that Iran won't necessarily be on his list of enemies forever.
I have never believed in having permanent enemies. I am different than a lot of people think. I don't like permanent enemies, but sometimes you need enemies to do the job, and you have to do it right. Enemies get you motivated. In fact, some of the closest friends of the United States of America are nations we fought wars against in generations past, and now they're our friends and our allies.
I don't know if our political panel has any permanent enemies they'd like to discuss, but maybe they do want to discuss President Trump's trip to the Middle East. So we turn to them on that note. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shan Zaino are with me. Rick Davis is Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist. Jeannie, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, obviously he did take some time to talk about Iran. He talked about Syria and relieving sanctions on Syria, Lebanon, Gaza. He did hit areas in the Middle East in which obviously there is ongoing geopolitical conflict, but we've said from the beginning that largely this trip is about the money. Is walking away from Saudi Arabia with $600 billion in investment pledges that the Saudis actually had already announced enough of a win?
I think it's a good backdrop for the trip. I mean, obviously, he brought a lot of business executives there to try and foment their own transactions, which I'm sure they're going to be well received. You got to remember, the entire Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, PIF, is only $1 trillion. So the idea that we would get a commitment for $1 trillion, which would represent 100% of the capacity of their sovereign wealth fund, is not really realistic. And Saudi Arabia is not the same it was 4 years ago when Donald Trump left office. They now operate in a budget deficit because of the massive giga projects that MBS has launched in his own country. So, whether they even have the capacity to do that over time is at least not an academic question. So, I think this was as good as anybody was going to get. Still a good thing for them to be committed to this kind of investment in the U.S. and more importantly, probably secures them as a very strong ally, certainly as long as Donald Trump's in office. Something that really was a question mark during the period of time when Joe Biden was in office and really didn't consider them as strategic an ally as Donald Trump does.
Well, when we consider these alliances or these partners potentially in the Middle East, Jeannie, knowing it's not just the Saudis he's paying a visit to, but Qatar and the UAE as well, how does it play at home, the U.S. drawing closer to these countries, bringing in dollars from these countries? I wonder here, this is how the president is spending his first big trip abroad of his second term, not going to somewhere you would maybe expect like the UK or Europe or one of our North American partners, but instead to the Middle East. Is it a good decision?
It's his first trip and his first administration was also to the Middle East. And I think while Americans may not pay as much attention to what is going on overseas, the way we obviously do what is going on in our own country, the fact is, I think it is a smart move for the president. There's not only the investment and business components that you've been talking about, but the strategic importance of the Middle East today, even more critical today than it was when he was first president. I mean, if we just reflect on the conflicts in the world today, whether that's Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Hamas, Israel, Pakistan, and India, these countries, the three he is visiting on this trip, have been key to resolving or trying to help the U.S. resolve those conflicts. And so from that perspective, in addition to all of the monetary aspects of this, the strategic importance of these places in the Middle East today is critical. And so I think that's so important. And Kaylee, I was so happy you started with Iran, because I thought this was the most interesting thing the president said today, which I saw as a warning to Iran. U.S. Donald Trump are being pressured by Israel to go a different route with Iran. And he is warning them that he could consider the bombing they've been talking publicly about if they don't come to the table for some kind of renewed deal on the nuclear program. So I'm really interested to see how that statement he made today lands in Tehran.
Well, absolutely. And when we consider it's not just Iran he wants to deal with, but some of the Iranian proxies that are engaged in conflict like Hamas in Israel, to the point Jeannie was making, the president did talk, Rick, about wanting to be a peacemaker, how that is one of his primary goals in his second term as president. He also was speaking specifically to Saudi Arabia, talking about how much he wants them to join the Abraham Accords. He called it his dream. Is this also a U.S. president that we see in live pursuit of a Nobel Peace Prize?
Yeah, he's not made it a secret that the two major things that he would like to accomplish in his term is make America rich again and win a Nobel Peace Prize. And I don't think that's a bad motivation. He's invested a lot of his own administration time and his time personally in trying to get a deal in Ukraine, although that seems to be a bit far off. He's pressured Bibi Netanyahu in the Middle East, and he has used this carrot and stick approach with a lot of regimes, basically saying either you're going to clean yourself up and become a part of the world community, or I'm going to use the stick on you. And so far, nobody has challenged that claim. They've pretty much found ways of playing inside his sandbox. And it'll be interesting to see if Iran does the same, because they do know that both the U.S. and Israel have the capacity to disrupt their ability to produce fissile material. And, do they cut a new deal? And the reality is the fact that Trump is offering one, they have to be scratching their head in Tehran going, oh, this sounds just like the Biden administration. Take the deal. It's definitely going to be better for Iran and for the rest of the world if they do.
Well, I'm glad you raised Ukraine as well, Rick, because we also learned from President Trump in his speech that after teasing yesterday the suggestion he himself might go to Turkey on Thursday to join the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in potential peace talks with Russia that we weren't sure whether or not Vladimir Putin would show up to, he said instead it's Marco Rubio that will be going. Do you see that, Jeannie, as the president in advance trying to save face in case Putin is a no-show and the whole thing turns out to be underwhelming?
Yeah, I think it might be. I thought all along it would be too early for the president to join. While it would be amazing to see all three of those men in the same room, if we could get a glimpse of it, I thought it would be too early. And I do think it may be a sign that, as we sort of indicated and thought, that Putin may not go there. And of course, then this leaves us exactly where we were. And this, of course, is another of the president's commitments on the campaign trail that he's having trouble getting to. Not surprisingly, he overpromised and is under-delivering, and you can see the frustration. And that's why I think he tends to these business deals, because he feels like he can have more luck there than he could on the geopolitical side in these really difficult conflicts.
Rick, we just have a minute left, but can Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Volodymyr Zelensky make progress themselves in Turkey, even if Russia is not at the table?
Well, I mean, Russia's got to be at the table to make progress. It doesn't have to be Vladimir Putin. They've got a team that have been negotiating with the U.S. over this for some time. And you'd never have the principals in a meeting if you didn't already have a baked deal. So the idea that all three of them are going to go and actually hash it out is just not realistic for where we are as nation states in the world today. So hopefully they'll make progress to the point where they can actually start talking about having the principals meeting. And that would indicate for the first time, I think, since they started this process, that they may be nearing something that would look like a deal.
All right, a reality check from Rick Davis alongside Jeannie Shanzano, our political panel on this Tuesday. Thank you, as always, for joining me here on Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
In Washington, where we've been keeping a close eye on the Middle East today, Saudi Arabia specifically, where President Trump spent his day speaking at the Saudi-U.S. Investment Forum in Riyadh on a number of different issues, of course, many of them targeted at the Middle East, geopolitical conflicts there that he would like to see end, investment he would like to see coming from the region into the United States. That's a big part of what this trip is all about. But we heard plenty about other things, too, including his tariff policy. The president actually took time to call out the agreement that was reached just days ago with China, calling it a breakthrough, talking about how China has agreed to open up to the U.S. for trade, though noting China still has to do that. And we'll see what happens. And as we consider this changing trade relationship between the U.S. and China, that is something that my colleague David Gura, Bloomberg correspondent, is focusing on today, as he had the chance to sit down with the former ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, of course, who held that position during the last administration under Joe Biden. And David Gura is joining me now. David, I do wonder the ambassador's thoughts about what we have seen from, honestly, since President Trump took office and the fentanyl tariffs almost immediately went into effect against China and others through Liberation Day to where we are now.
Well, he's watching it with great interest, and thanks for having me, Kaylee. As you might expect, and this was one of the hardest jobs in government when he had it, right on the heels of COVID, having to navigate a very much changed China. And we talked a lot about that, about what the landscape looked like while he was there and the work that he did to kind of rehabilitate that relationship after the first Trump term, the work he did to try to secure a new line, a conduit of communication between Washington and Beijing. And we talked about what's happened since he left government. So his last day was on January 20th. He came back to Boston. He's now a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School and has been watching all of this happen from afar. And as you suggest, and that's where I began the interview, just asking him sort of how he watched what unfolded in Geneva over the course of the weekend, and if he sees what occurred there, the outcome of that meeting, as a positive step. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Well, first of all, I start from a first principle, and that is that China's been the largest and most important disruptor in the global trade system for about 3 decades right now. There's a reason why the United States and many other countries around the world have placed tariffs on China. China's manufactured exports in particular is because China's been dumping them. around the world below the cost of production. And it's been a killer for jobs, both in the United States historically in the last several decades, but also around the world. You have a situation now where Turkey and India and Brazil and Colombia and Mexico and Canada and the United States and the European Union have all put tariffs on China. So I have a degree of sympathy for the situation that President Trump and his team inherited, which was a situation that we left when I left in mid-January as ambassador to China. President Biden, a year ago, in May 2024, placed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, 50% on semiconductors, 25% on lithium batteries. So the root of this problem is China and Chinese trade policy. The Chinese are trying to act now. You saw it in the statements over the weekend from Vice Premier He Lifeng, is that they're the innocent party, that they are the victim of this trade war by President Trump, when in fact, and that they're the responsible party, when in fact the reality is quite different. I think it's important to set the stage. Having said that, these are going to be very, very difficult negotiations over the next 90 days. I think in the end, self-interest and logic will prevail. Both sides need an agreement. It was encouraging to hear Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent say that they had agreed in principle they don't want to decouple these two economies. Last year we had a $642 billion two-way trade relationship in goods and services with China. China's our third largest trade partner. About 1 million American jobs depend on trade with China. Upwards of 20 million manufacturing jobs in China depend on trade with the United States. So neither country can afford to sunder the economic ties and the millions of interactions that our private sector has had with the Chinese economy over the last 40 years. And I think in the end, there will be a trade agreement. But getting there, I think, is going to be extraordinarily difficult.
And I asked him sort of how he sees these next 90 days playing out. And he said there's going to have to be a lot of urgency and a lot of alacrity on the part of both the U.S. And China as they try to have that sort of consultative mechanism, as the Treasury Secretary put it, go into effect, kind of maintain the level of dialogue that they had over the course of the weekend. And he's optimistic that something will come from this, but again, underscores how difficult it's going to be. We had a very wide-ranging conversation. Something we talked an awful lot about is just the state of the State Department today, of U.S. diplomacy. He spent most of his 45-year career in the State Department. He's lived in 7 countries. China was the last one in which he lived. And I asked him at the end just sort of what he's telling his students today about sort of the path forward for diplomacy. Obviously, he's teaching a lot of students who wanted to go down a path that's since been foreclosed. If we've seen the cuts in the U.S. diplomatic corps, he's telling them to be patient. He thinks that there's going to be an awareness, a broader awareness in the end, Kayleigh, that it's important to have career diplomats like himself. A fascinating conversation. I thought we're going to make it available as a Big Take podcast soon, so I encourage everybody to download that as they can.
Absolutely. That's where you can find the conversation in full, hosted, of course, by David Gura from the Bloomberg Big Take podcast and Bloomberg correspondent, joining us live from Boston today. Thank you so much. And as we consider the de-escalated, if you will, trade tensions between the U.S. and China, the tariff rate that has been taken lower, at least for this 90-day period, it does beg the question of what difference that will ultimately make for the U.S. economy and the inflationary pressures that could have resulted if tariffs stayed as high as they were. We got CPI data today that, of course, showed inflation pressures in the economy that were cooler than expected in the month of April, with just a 0.2% increase month on month. And President Trump has finally chimed in on that data, taking to Truth Social at a pretty late hour in the Middle East where he is right now, saying no inflation and prices of gasoline, energy, groceries, and practically everything else are down, in all caps. The Fed must lower the rate, like Europe and China have done. What is wrong with too late Powell? Not fair to America, which is ready to blossom. Just let it all happen. It will be a beautiful thing. Let's see if Kitty Richards agrees whether or not that would be a beautiful thing. She's senior fellow at the Groundwork Collaborative and is joining me here in our Washington, D.C. studio. Good to have you back.
Thanks so much,
on
Kayleigh.
Balance of Power. When you look at the inflation data we got today, which, yes, is cooler than expected, is there a case to be made that with the lack of increased elevated inflationary pressures that seem to have amounted thus far, at least, from tariffs, that the Fed could be safe to do what the president says? Go ahead and cut the rate?
I think the Fed is in a really complicated position, and I don't envy them. I have been arguing for quite some time, for a couple of years now, that the Fed was behind the curve on lowering rates. But the uncertainty created by the tariffs, I think we're not really seeing tariff effects showing up in prices yet. But that's partly just because those effects wouldn't be showing up yet, right? All of this has happened very rapidly. And if you think about imported goods, I think sometimes we forget, we're just starting to feel the warmth of summer here. But people who are trying to place orders for imported goods are placing orders now for Christmas presents, because it takes a long time for container ships to arrive here. So we're not seeing the shortages and the supply chain disruptions really play out yet. I think that puts the Fed in a difficult position. And we've got Fed governors talking about stagflation, right? The worry that we've already seen consumer confidence just fall through the floor. And if we start to see demand being reduced at the same time as we're having these supply problems, we could be in a really difficult position for managing both inflation and unemployment.
Well, to that point, is the lagged effect, the time of the lag, the same for what could happen in consumer demand and in the labor market as it is for when it shows up in inflation data? I'm just wondering what triggers the Fed first.
I think that's a really good question, and it's hard to say how that's all going to play out. I do think it, as has happened every month for a couple of years now, one of the big standouts in the inflation report was high shelter inflation. Housing costs are continuing to go up and up. And that's where I'd like to see policymakers really focus. Those are the prices that are really locking Americans out of the middle class. But again, it's a really difficult position for monetary policymakers to be in. They have very blunt instruments for dealing with these problems. And when things are being thrown at them at this speed, it's hard to know how the economy is going to react.
I just want to point out for our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio that we do have eyes on President Trump arriving to dinner with the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia after the two of them, of course, appeared together at the Saudi-U.S. Investment Forum earlier today. That's just one leg, of course, of the president's wider trip to the Middle East, which, Kitty, in large part is about attracting investment from these countries, not just the Saudis, but the UAE and Qatar as well, and bringing it to the United States. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars or even trillions, if you believe the math of the president, that companies are investing here. How long is that going to take to materialize, to make a difference in available jobs in the U.S. and actual hiring practices, in productivity? Is most of this even going to be realized realistically by the time he leaves office?
I think there's a real open question about whether these sorts of negotiations will yield much fruit at all. The United States is already a very attractive place for foreign investment, but it's because of things like our very stable bond market and our highly educated workforce. It's the investments that we've made in our people and our country that make this an attractive place to invest. And I don't think that the economic policy of the Trump administration is aiding in those draws to foreign capital. The other question is, even if there is additional investment, how will that actually translate for workers and families? And that's one of the things that I think is often missed in the conversation about the tariffs, especially, that if your goal is to reshore manufacturing and bring back good, strong American jobs, you have to have worker power and worker protection to ensure that that happens. Otherwise, things like tariffs, we saw this during the supply chain disruptions during the pandemic. Supply chain disruptions become just another opportunity for powerful corporations to price gouge. They don't have to share those profits with their workers. We saw corporations turning in record profits over and quarter after quarter during a time where prices were skyrocketing and wages were barely keeping up. And so, if you think about an economic policy that is trying to center that sort of revival of the American working class, we're really missing some pretty important pieces. And in fact, on the other side of town, we've got Capitol Hill marking up.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you.
Big bills that are going to, if Republicans in Congress have their way, Trump's big, beautiful bill is going to kick millions of people off their health insurance, increase health insurance costs for millions more by an average of $700 a year, and also hand out more tax breaks to multinational corporations for their overseas profits. So if you're trying to bring investment and jobs into the country, it's really hard to see how this pencils out with the tax bill.
We have less than a minute left here, Kitty, but you also have no tax on tipped income or overtime until 2028, an expansion of the child tax credit that people can claim. Are there not good things in here for the American working class?
So I think no tax on tips and overtime is a really perfect example of something that it sounds like you are talking about working class people, but the fact of the matter is, if you work in a restaurant and are a waitress and trying to make ends meet with your family, you're going to get pennies out of no tax on tips. Whereas if you are a fancy consultant who's able to reclassify your income as gratuities, which, let me tell you, there's going to be a whole law practice that springs up around how to do that. You could get tens of thousands of dollars out of this. So there are a lot of these Trump tax cuts that are really Trojan horses for tax cuts for the wealthy.
All right. Kitty Richards of the Groundwork Collaborative.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Republicans want to keep the House in 2026, where every seat will be up for grabs. And the Senate is another question, too, as there's a number of key seats that are in play, including one in Michigan, thanks to the retirement of Senator, or the planned retirement, that is, of Senator Gary Peters, the Democrat. It's kicking off a contest for his seat, who will sit there next. And there are a number of Democrats already in this primary. Of course, current U.S. Congresswoman Haley Stevens, former Michigan Speaker Joe Tate, State Senator Mallory McGuire, and our next guest here on Balance of Power, Abdul El-Sayed, Ed, is joining us as well. He is, of course, a Democratic candidate for Senate in the state of Michigan, and we appreciate your time and joining us here on Bloomberg, sir. When we consider the legislation that is currently underway on Capitol Hill, the idea that it will provide some tax breaks to those who, say, work on tipped income or work overtime hours, they won't see their taxes go up as a result of the 2017 tax cuts expiring, but knowing also that there will be some people who may get kicked off Medicaid rolls. On net, what does it mean? How does it play in a state like Michigan?
I think on net, it's a disaster. I think the points that you made about those particular tax breaks, I agree with them. They're just a fig leaf, though, for what will ultimately be major Medicaid cuts that'll drop 500,000 Michiganders and millions more across this country off of Medicaid. I just want to be clear, right? We talk about Medicaid as a health insurance program for the poor, but one in every other kid in Michigan is insured via Medicaid. And they're talking about work requirements. I just want you to think about this. Are we going back to an era of child labor and we're going to make kids work for their Medicaid? This makes no sense. The real folks who are going to get the biggest tax breaks tend to be the billionaires who Donald Trump seems to want to give an opportunity every single moment he can. I mean, it's as if the stock tip that he gave them just before he pulled back on his disastrous tariffs weren't enough. Now he wants to cut their taxes. And meanwhile, he's out in the Middle East accepting a gift of a $400 million airplane. And you got to question, the dude really likes golden toilets. Does this airplane have golden toilets too? I mean, this is just it's a disaster for working people across my state and a disaster for working people across the country.
And I would point out for our audience who may not be able to spot this, I do believe that is a Medicare for All book that is on the bookshelf behind you as we have this conversation. What is then the appropriate way to address issues around entitlements, knowing that financially there's an argument that these are not going to be sustainable for much longer, that there is, of course, an impetus to cut spending, to rein in the debt and deficit. If you were to sit in the U.S. Senate, how would you suggest fixing that problem if you don't want to take away benefits from those who need it?
To me, the real question is sustainability for the average family in Michigan. And I think they're watching as their grocery prices are going through the roof. They're watching as they're worried about falling into debt simply for going to see a doctor. They're worried about whether or not they're going to be able to have a job next year, let alone tomorrow. They're worried about whether or not their kid's school is a place that's educating that kid for the future. And right now, they're finding it all deeply unsustainable. Now, the way that we finance government too often has focused on the well-being of the Fortune 500 rather than the well-being of the 350 million of us who make this country what it is. And so to me, my vision for government is one where the everyday American worker understands that their life in the richest, most powerful country in the world is in fact sustainable, and that we need to make decisions about where we invest our dollars to be building toward that sustainability. To everybody watching, to me, we all know that the engine of an economy is people, right? It's people having incredible ideas and opportunities to build that. And to me, that looks like an economy built on small businesses. It's an economy where rather than passing tax cuts for the biggest companies, we're making it easier to build and scale and grow a small business that takes its wealth and puts it back into the local community. There's just a difference in vision here, but we can, in fact, do the things that we've done for a very long time if we're willing to make decisions about how we right-size our economy. You go back 50, 60, 70 years from here, and you look at when the economy was buzzing the strongest. It's a moment when we used to tax corporations and the wealthy at a far higher rate so that we could actually invest in the well-being of everyday folks. And I think we just need to be thinking and studying our history to go back to that time.
Well, when we consider the economy of Michigan and the workers in Michigan in particular, President Trump argues that one of the ways to bring about that kind of renaissance, to be reinvesting in the U.S. economy, is the imposition of tariffs, which we have seen on things like autos and which actually have been welcomed by many workers in the auto sector, if not the companies themselves, people who would, if you were to be a Michigan senator, be your constituents. And I wonder, and I've asked this of one of your opponents, Mallory McMorrow, as well, what your message would be to those who feel like the trade policies of President Trump actually do serve to benefit them.
Yeah, I want to be clear about something. NAFTA has been a disaster for working people across our state. It's hollowed out towns. It's destroyed a whole way of life for folks in Michigan. And so the way I think about it, and forgive me, I'm a doctor, so offer me an analogy here. I think about it like a cancer. And if you want to treat cancer, everybody knows that you need a bit of chemotherapy. Now, the thing about chemotherapy is that it's a poison. So you use it very, very sparingly. You use it in a very directed way, and you're constantly tracking what the impact is because, of course, you want to kill the tumor, the cancer, before it hurts the patient too much. Now, if you think about tariffs as that chemotherapy, right, then the way you'd want to do this is to be really thoughtful about the kind of industries that you want to invest in. You make those investments, you let your trading partners know that you're going to be tariffing around these particular industries. You set a set of benchmarks, and then as those companies meet those benchmarks, you start to pull away, always telegraphing what it is you're going to do. But the thing about Donald Trump is that he gets the right problem, and then his solution is always ham-handed, it's always chaotic, and it's always self-serving, which is exactly what we saw with this iteration of tariffs. So while tariffs themselves can be a useful tool like chemotherapy to treat cancer, the way that he's gone about to do it is really more about accruing power with corporate CEOs and bringing them to heel than it is about actually addressing the problem, as we see with the fact that he's now blinked and we're kind of back to square one. And you got to ask yourself, what did we achieve here, aside from more inflation and the destruction of thousands of small businesses across our state and our country?
Well, we did just hear from President Trump talking in part about his tariff policy at the Saudi-U.S. Investment Forum in Riyadh, but he used his time to touch on a number of subjects as well, including the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. We obviously are paying close attention to whether Israel potentially escalates things in Gaza even further. And knowing what a flashpoint that was as an issue in Michigan in particular in 2024, I wonder if you're anticipating the same thing in 2026.
Michiganders of all stripes, they'll drop their kids off at school or their grandkids off at school. They look at that school and they say, man, that place doesn't look much different than it did 30 years ago when I went there. I wonder what a couple $1 million might do for that school. And instead, our government has been doing this thing of sending tens of billions of dollars to a foreign military to drop bombs on other kids and their schools. And I think all of us understand that that kind of investment, it's contrary to what's good for all of us. And so I know that Michiganders would rather us be spending our money here investing in our kids rather than sending them to foreign militaries. And I do anticipate that it's going to continue to be an issue simply because it makes no sense for the average Michigander, and it makes no sense for our country.
Well, and of course, on that issue and others, you are trying to draw a distinction between that and your primary opponents in this Democratic contest for this Senate seat. And I wonder how you're thinking about differentiating yourself compared to those who are running against you? And if this risks exposing through this primary some of the fissures within the Democratic Party right now that obviously has been wrestling with itself in the aftermath of the last election?
I'll tell you this, I got nothing but respect for folks who are running right now to take on Trump and Trumpism, given all of the damage that he's done to our country and its standing abroad, and all the damage he's doing to the lives of everyday folks in my state and elsewhere. That being said, the big difference with me is just that I don't take corporate contributions for a reason, because I think that Donald Trump is actually just the symptom of a far bigger disease. And that disease is the politics that have been dominated by corporate interests and frankly, the interests of billionaires. And I think that has led us to a system where the economy doesn't work for working people, where we can't guarantee people health care, where our air, water, and soil get corrupted by the interests of a few very, very large corporations. I think we can do better. And so what you're going to hear from me is somebody who's taking the time to listen to everyday folks and talking very clearly about the kinds of policy solutions to take on monopolies that are raising the price of our groceries, or to address the way that big tech is corrupting our minds and our families, fracking our attention out of our eyeballs and eardrums, the ability to guarantee healthcare for everybody, like the book that I wrote on Medicare for All. And so that is going to be the big focus. And part of me for that is, I'm not going to pull punches when it comes to a foreign policy that has us being first among equals, actually following the rules of the rules-based international order that our predecessors set about after World War II. We got an opportunity to do so much better, to invest in our own communities and to take on the power of the richest, most powerful folks that are leaving us more unequal, angrier, and more lonely, and less well-to-do for it.
All right, Abdul, we appreciate you joining us here on Balance of Power. Abdul El-Sayed, Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate in Michigan. Thank you for joining us live from Ann Arbor.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.